Okay, next up is going to be Ravenous, a zombie apocalypse LitRPG, Necrotic Apocalypse, book number 1, written by David Pietri. It is 529 pages, it is $4.99, and it's available on Kindle Unlimited. And here's the author's description. An unstoppable curse, a dead man displaced from his time. How do you survive the zombie apocalypse when you started it? Digby Graves, a deceased medieval peasant with delusions of grandeur, is trying to figure out how the hell he ended up in Seattle 800 years after his death. Also, why does he have necrotic magic coursing through his zombified body? Added to that is the fact that he made a terrible first impression the moment he woke up by lunging at the first person that came into a biting range. Now the curse he unleashed is loose in the world. Digby has a target on his back and only fragmented memories of his death. He needs to survive long enough to put the pieces back together, learn what it means to lead the horde, and master his power over the dead. Digby might even find a few accomplices along the way, if he can hold off from eating them. The end of the world is gonna get weird. Okay, this is it's a zombie apocalypse story told from the point of view of a zombie apocalypse, a zombie who is displaced in time, I guess a little bit, about 800 years. That's kind of the kernel of what it is. I'd say the beginning of the story is a little bit tedious. The introduction of the premise is keep it unique, displaced in time, zombie from 800 years ago. Is a pretty different start, but beyond that initial nugget, the beginning of the story is just him. Oh, I'm in a different place in time. What's going on here? Oh, look, zombie apocalypse. I'm making zombies. And him kind of just exploring that bit of it. He comes across a couple different people that he, of course, either eats or saves, or just kind of interacts with, without trying to spoil things too much for you. But there's no real purpose to the story in the first, I'd say, quarter-ish. And it's not really until you get a very clear antagonist that's introduced in the story, about that point, about 20-25%, that the story really seems to get going and finding its legs. There's definitely setup of other things happening in the first 20-25%. But again, it felt a little bit tedious for me in that I wasn't really sure what the point of the story was, what the goals for the main character was besides, leaving the city. So once those things were established, once there's a very clear bad guy, or at least antagonistic entity to the main character, you get goals, you get stakes, and so the story really does clarify a bit more. And for the most part, I really did enjoy the story. There are a few places in it where the game mechanics of the story felt a bit forced, or it felt like the author kind of goes on this tangent that doesn't really lead anywhere. For example, someone who's over 800 years old, or who existed in a world 800 years ago, he for some reason seems to speak perfectly modern English along with slang. He also, there's a slight fudging of some game mechanics that were established, so the main character can just kind of do cool things, or practicing them once and getting new skills and abilities, which really isn't what's described. I think the undead horse bit in the story was like, oh, that's interesting. It doesn't have a point, and there's just like a callback in the. Other than that, I don't see why it exists in the story, but I get the author's just, oh, look, that's a cool thing to do. Let's play along with that for a second. That's perfectly fine. It's just like, oh, it's just, for me as a reader, it's like, that doesn't go anywhere. And maybe it's something that the author just thought, that's a cool thing to have. I'm going to write it in because it's fun, and that's great. For me, those are just tiny drawbacks because they took away from a bit of my enjoyment of the story, and that they didn't make sense. They felt a little forced in for me at times. But for the most part, really decent story. Again, interesting setup for a zombie from another time, essentially coming into the world and accidentally setting off a zombie apocalypse. I've read, anytime I get a monster main character, I expect a little bit of more monstrousness. And that exists to a degree, in that the main character is a zombie. He never wanted to be a zombie, so he doesn't necessarily try to do bad things. He ends up doing them. I think the most monstrous part is that he ends up accidentally eating a couple people. In the beginning, we can't control it, but so the author kind of gives them a free pass in being monstrous, which I understand that you want your characters to be heroic, but as a monster, he has to do these things to survive. But to take away that aspect of choice, it felt like a little bit of crap. I really would have rather appreciated him choosing consciously to do what he needed to do to survive, instead of just it being a default. Oh, he's bad, but it doesn't mean to be bad, and it's the default Ravenous state of the main character to do it, or seeing him explore what he has to do to survive with these zombified monster powers. The main character kind of gets to dip his toe in a couple different zombie classes. Instead of developing a clear, powerful path, or even having like alternative like minions who are clearly developing one of those classes to be as powerful as possible. So in that respect, the RPG progression was a little bit mixed. There were some really interesting things. A few class powers that were like, oh, that's kind of cool, but it's not really developed as much as I think I would have liked to have seen it. Or maybe the author is just kind of putting some of that development path work, saving for book 2 or 3, whatever the case is. Either way, I was like, oh, that's neat. Probably didn't go as far as I was hoping it would in the smart use of those mechanics necessarily, but still fairly decent. The fights are mostly well done, neat tactics, and a few of them I thought, oh, that was pretty clever. Again, RPG style for regular clear rules, under-themed powers, consistent power games. I could plan a build for a zombie character, so you know that there's enough information there for the RPG progression. So good stuff there. Overall, there were like a few issues or game rule issues for me. Fairly good read. And probably the novel from the author that I've enjoyed the most. So we'll leave it at that. Had an overall good time. 7.3 out of 10 for me. That's a good review score. Still, just with issues. That's Ravenous, a zombie apocalypse LitRPG story, Necrotic Apocalypse, book number 1, with a score of 7.3 out of 10. So there you go.